Thank you all very much. I want to spend a couple of minutes in my time talking about, pick up on something that Bud Krogh said, and tell just a little bit about how I got into this area. It's interesting to me that in medical school, I had the experience, actually when I was an intern, I had the experience of having a call announced over the intercom system. Actually, this was in medical school in Boston, that the White House was calling. And the person who was calling turned out to be Burt Brown, who we'll hear a lot about. And when I applied to NIH for my 2 years for the Public Health Service, I like to say that getting into Harvard Medical School was a piece of cake compared to getting into NIH during the Vietnam War, where every physician in the country faced at least 2 years, and that was a very competitive thing. One of my people making recommendation said the only person he could compare me to was Burt Brown. And I thought that's kind of interesting to think about that and the way things played out over this period of time. But anyhow, I was and am a Democrat. I came into this field from psychiatry, interested in making a contribution, a social contribution. My heroes, personally, were John Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. And I chose corrections. I wanted to go to corrections and work with people who were in prison. I was in love with prisoners and prisons and went to work. And those of you who haven't been in prisons can't understand that, but I think most of you who have worked in prisons can understand that. They're very, very interesting people, very worthy people of helping. At least that's the way I think about it then, thought about it then and do now. And so I went to work for the DC Department of Corrections in 1968, full of zeal, with a lot of energy. It was very unusual to have a Harvard-trained psychiatrist from NIH to go to work for the Department of Corrections. I went there and just said, I'll do whatever needs to be done. I just want an opportunity to make a contribution. That's all I was asking for. And I quickly got caught up. One of the first things that happened was the director of the Department of Corrections was under a lot of pressure from the new administration, Walter Washington and Thomas Fletcher, to come up with new plans and corrections of what the department could do to become an exemplary department. And he asked me to recruit his deputy. So within 3 months of joining the department, I was recruiting my boss, who was going to run the department, the deputy to Kenneth Hardy. And when I did that in the summer of 1968, one of the best things I did there was recruit a wonderful guy from California named Bob Montilla. There was an election in November of 1968. And again, in my life, I thought only Democrats could become president. It never occurred to me that a Republican could actually be elected president. And here we had this Republican elected president, and everybody in the Department of Corrections gave up. This was the end of the world as we knew it. We had no hope for anything that we would possibly do in the future. John Mitchell had given his talk about crime during the campaign from Toledo, which is where I was from. And I thought, yeah, that was a marker, that a fate for me, that my nail in my coffin about that. And Montilla wouldn't come to join the Department of Corrections because this president had come in. Donfeld was talking about that attitude there. And what happened on January 20th, 1969, when Nixon became president, and I want to just say this to fill out something that Bud Krogh said and what was going on at the time in the city government. At that time. The big question was whether Walter Washington and Thomas Fletcher would be reappointed. And the obvious answer was no, they would not be. They were finished. These were Democratic political appointees. And when Richard Nixon on January 20th reappointed them, it was the most amazing thing what happened in this city. An attitude change was just amazing. Nobody could imagine that Richard Nixon would do that. And then, as Bud said, Nixon had said this was the crime capital of the nation. And he did nothing about crime when he got started. And two citizens, actually about half a dozen citizens, but two I was very close to, said that they were not going to accept that. And that was Edward Bennett Williams and Katharine Graham. And they went down to see Richard Nixon, and it was probably February, and said, we will hold a weekly press conference about crime in Washington and lets you do something. Now, that's the way they told it to me, what happened. So that Nixon was put on notice about crime in Washington. He had made that an issue, and by God, he was going to do it. Those two Democrats wanted to make sure he did it, and they were prepared to help him. They weren't hostile. To talk about the bipartisan attitudes about this. By May of '69, now think about this, he comes in January 20th. By May, we had a supplemental appropriations for the District of Columbia for crime, and every idea that I had when I came there, which got no support before, no support, was funded 3 times over. And you think, and there was no political filter put onto that at all. What you think is right, that's what we want to do. Boom. And of course, that just changed my whole life. It was at that point, Bud was talking about how we did this, and the seminal event was in August of '69. And in that month, with some college students in the summer, we did urine testing in DC jail. Everybody who came to DC jail in August of '69 got a drug test. And those drug tests showed 44% were positive for heroin. That was with thin layer chromatography, which is what we used at that time. And then we asked them just a couple of questions. What year did you first use heroin? Was the one that really changed everything. And from that data, we were able to show that when we plotted the year of first heroin use against the crime rate in the District of Columbia, there was a direct linear relationship, showing that this started in the middle 1960s, and it rose steadily through '69, and the crime rate tracked right with it. That was published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And that study established the connection between heroin addiction and urban crime. It was that simple. And that's when it happened. Bud was talking about speed. By September, we'd started our drug treatment program in the Department of Corrections. February 18th, 1970, NTA was started by Walter Washington. He's one of my heroes, one of the people who really, and Bud says too, he was an unbelievably good mayor. Unbelievable. He wasn't interested in the politics. It didn't matter to him that Nixon was a Republican. He wanted to do the best he could for this city, and there was no doubt about it. I used to we were talking about criticism about methadone. I was certainly ground zero for that. And I would get so beat up. I'd get so beat up, I didn't want to come back to work anymore. And I go to see the mayor, Walter Washington, and I say, I just can't take it. He said, you know, Bob, he says, if I don't get at least 4 complaints a day about you, I figure you must be sick. He said, you know, I'm worried you're going to leave this job, and I don't want that to happen. And he said, the people of this city appreciate what you're doing. The people who are giving you a hard time are a tiny fraction. And he said, by the way, unless you think this is a racial thing, he said, most of those people are white, not black, who are giving you a problem, which was absolutely true. But to have him say that would get me, okay, by God, I'm going to go back and do battle again. My first meeting with Bud Krogh in the White House, imagine, again, of course, when you're a doctor, when you're a kid, you're a little older than when you're a lawyer and you're a kid. So, but I was just out of medical school, called into the White House, there to meet Bud Krogh and his group with Jeff Donfeld, Jeff Shepard. I mean, it was, to me, an awesome group in the West Wing of the White House. That was a pretty big deal. And I went there and told him my little song and dance, what we were doing at NTA and all these things. And came to the end of the meeting, and I was going out, and I thought, oh gosh, I've got a problem. I had been late to the meeting and rushing around and getting through the clearance and all this, parked in a public lot, and I realized I did not have any cash to get my car out of the parking lot. So I came to Bud and I said, at the end of the meeting, I said, could you loan me $5 for a parking ticket to get out of here? I thought maybe he'd forgotten that. I told that to somebody else here, and they said, you know, are you sure you paid him back? You'll probably remember now.
A lot of interest since then.
That's right. But I just want to say that by the summer of 1970, NTA started February 18th, 1970. Within 2 months, we had 2,000 people in treatment in 20 treatment centers. Never before had that kind of deployment gone on in such a short period of time. By July, we had a television reporter named George Allen, the same name as the football coach, but not related, did an hour-long documentary exposing me and methadone on Channel 9. And WTOP, you still listen to it on the radio. They were nonstop radio then. Every day they had a new program saying that I was a liar, that I was poisoning the citizens, especially black citizens. And it was relentless, day after day after day, coming up to a full 1-hour primetime documentary about what a bad guy I was. I'd heard about this when George Allen came to my office for an interview. I thought he was just another reporter. I started off, how's things going? How's the program? I'd say, fine, good, whatever. He said, well, you're a liar. I said, what do you mean? He says, none of that's true. We've investigated. All your statistics are fraudulent. You're a Nixon operative. You're destroying the city. And we're going to put that on the television. And I didn't know what did that mean? I don't know. But boy, it was bad. And we had 2 little kids at the time. They would go to school. Their teachers would ask them about it. The other kids would ask about it. It was really rough. What happened about that? Well, that's very interesting, because the Washington Post and the Washington Star, which was then a co-equal paper, put their editorial people and their news people onto that story. And a fellow named Phil Jalen, who was the editor of the editorial page of the Washington Post at the time, told me the story that he went to Katharine Graham, and he said, because she owned WTOP at the time, this was her station that was doing this, he said, we're going to editorialize opposing what your television station is saying. Is that a problem? And Katharine Graham said, you do what you think is the right thing. That's it. So the Washington Post came out with a lead editorial, looked into all the statistics, every charge one at a time, and supported what I was doing. As if this wasn't enough, Edward Bennett Williams called me and said he wanted to help out if he could. I said, well, I don't know how you would do that. He said, well, why don't we talk to this George Allen, this reporter? And I said, okay, well, how would we do that? He said, well, tell him you've got a lawyer and you'd like to talk to him about what he's saying on the air. And I said, what do you mean I have a lawyer? I'm a city government guy. He said, well, I'm your lawyer. He said, I can't afford to pay you. He said, you don't have to pay me. I said, well, when could we meet with him? He said, you tell him you'll meet anytime, any place, and your lawyer will be there with you. Oh, really? Okay, so we decided, I called George Allen up, and he was really on a roll at that. Well, this was before the Post had come out. He was on a roll. He was going to go get me. My scalp was already, on his belt. And I said, well, I got this lawyer who's working with me. He said, who's that? I said, Edward Bennett Williams. Long pause on the other end. So when he showed up with 2 lawyers from Covington and Burling. And they came in, and we came to Edward Bennett Williams' office, which was full of Vince Lombardi things, because he was the coach of the Redskins at that time. And Edward Williams at the end of the table, and George Allen down at the end, and these 2 people from Covington and Burling who were shaking like this at this meeting. And so he said, Williams said, well, what's the problem here with Bob and the program? And he'd give something, and he said, well, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. You got anything else for that? And he went through this a couple times, and the guy was just, George Allen was really sweating. And Williams said, well, come on, let's see, is there anything more? He said, we need to talk in the lobby about this, in the halls. He goes, oh, that's fine. They came back and said, we don't have anything more to say, we're leaving. But that was the end, and the next thing I know, he left town, and I never heard from him again. But it was an example of vulnerability and somebody stepping up to the plate, and it was very interesting. I didn't just get to this job either. The sponsor to me was a freshman senator from Maryland, Joseph Tidings, and his staff director who was helping was Al Frum, who started the Democratic Leadership Council. And that was how when Bud, when all this went on, Bud said the same kind of thing and looked at the Democrats and the Republicans. There was no partisan conflict. Nothing, because everybody was working together. Well, I just want to tell those things about how that happened. Not just one other quick thing, and that is about Well, let me go back to a couple things about special action. Now I've got to stop here. The main thing we did, well, I had 1.5 years under the Nixon administration, and my handler in that time was Jeff Shepard. Jeff was the guy I reported to. Nobody told me he just did law enforcement. I didn't know that because Bud Krogh had gone to the Department of Transportation at that point. And then when the administration changed and it became the Ford administration, my handler was Dick Parsons. Just like Jeff and Bud are phenomenal people, then as now, Dick Parsons was one of the most impressive people I ever worked with. Everybody loved Dick Parsons. He was just a phenomenal human being who really did a great job for the Ford administration in this area. And as probably most of you know, he's the leading black businessman in the world. He's head of Time Warner and is just a phenomenally wonderful, wonderful guy. I talked to Nelson Rockefeller during that Ford administration, and he couldn't get over the fact that I had come from the Nixon administration, and he had made drug abuse his top priority in his administration as governor. It was a very big deal for him. And he said, everything I did backfired. Nothing ever worked. He hated Nixon. And he couldn't imagine how this dumb guy, Richard Nixon, had done such a great job with drugs. And he had done so terribly with drugs. He couldn't figure that out. And I've thought about why that was, and I think it really was the kind of openness that Bud had was terrific. But, and this is, I guess, where I'll just end here, what Bud did was he looked outside of the established expertise and tried to find the new ideas. He didn't go to NI. He didn't go to Elliot Richardson at HEW because Elliot Richardson couldn't help him. It wasn't that he didn't want to. Elliot Richardson was captured by attitudes. And the same thing was true in the Justice Department. That if you went to those people, the answers were not going to help you. And that's why Jerry and I were young people coming into the field, didn't represent any kind of bureaucracy, didn't have that kind of history, were prepared to have some different, let's call it, ideas. And that made all this, and what happened to Nelson Rockefeller, he did the same thing in New York, but he did it 4 years earlier. And that made all the difference. Because the people who were the best and the brightest at that point were into civil commitment. He then signed on to that as his approach to the problem. He went away from methadone. And of course, down that road, he got buried by, as Nixon was saying with Bud, the numbers. He couldn't deal with the numbers. So I don't know that he was not as smart. His timing was everything about how this went on. Okay, I'm going to go to our panel. Could I possibly convince you that I have 4 more hours of things I'd like to say? Would you possibly believe that? But I'm going to restrain myself, and I'm going to go on. And I've asked Peter Bourne to join also. And I'm going to ask each of them to do what I haven't done, is stay to 10 minutes. The first person I'm going to introduce is Karst Bessemer. You already heard Jerry's statement about Karst. Not just an honest man, but a man who understood about addiction and who had a brilliance of dealing with bureaucracies like no one else I ever worked with. And it was my privilege to have Karst as my deputy. And you're in for a treat from hearing from Karst.
Thank you, Bob. The leadership was from outside, young. That makes me feel good. Jerry and I worked together 58 to 60 at Lexington, so I must have been young at that time too, but I didn't understand it. I am not an outsider. I came into the Public Health Service in 1957, and I left the Public Health Service in 1984. I served from Eisenhower through to the first Reagan administration. I came up through the Bureau of Medical Services. And if within the Public Health Service, that's like coming up from the Sanitation Department compared to NIH. The Bureau of Medical Services did all the heavy lifting. We treated Indians, we treated American seamen, we did all the sort of dirty public health work. And as things would evolve, one of my colleagues at Lexington became an associate director of NIMH, and the Congress passed a thing called the Narcotic Addict Rehabilitation Act, and they were looking for somebody who knew something about an addict, and Sherm Kiefer called, and I went to NIMH. Now, you have to understand that the attitude at NIMH was, we don't like to deal with addiction. That was the attitude in the community mental health centers. That was the attitude basically in research. It wasn't an accident that the Addiction Research Center asked to come on to the NIH campus as part of NIMH, and NIH turned them down. It left Lexington when we closed Lexington, but it's now in Baltimore. It's not on where the core of PHS research goes. So there's great bureaucratic attitudes. When SAO was announced, executive order, immediately who was Jerry Jaffe within the bureaucracy? I said, oh, I know Jerry, 58. In fact, I know him in his Austin Healey days. And he had a little two-seat roadster that sometimes didn't run too good on a wet day. I had a Morris Minor, I had the same problem. And so when the formal relationships between NIMH and SAO were set up, I was excluded because I had a personal relationship with the announced leader. Now, I think people have testified to the fact that their relationship was somewhat sour. Some few months after that, I was designated as the liaison. I guess they figured it couldn't get any worse. Send him downtown and see if we can communicate better. But one of the really important things that happened during this first year before SAO was totally legal happened in March of '72. Right after lunch, we got a phone call from the department. The secretary asked that everybody at NIMH in the line, the director, I was the acting director of the Division of Narcotic Addiction and Drug Abuse, my branch chiefs, my center director, my NARA chief, everybody, and then going up through the administration, the assistant secretary, and the assistant secretary for legislation, be in the secretary's office at 4 o'clock. No, nothing else, just be there. Now, I worked in the department for many years. I never had that request made in that way during my entire career. We complied. We walked in, Secretary Richardson was at his desk. He had chairs arranged in a semicircle. He said, I want everybody to understand that drug abuse is the president's priority. When you get a request from SAO, from the White House, you answer the request, then you tell me about it. I don't want anybody to say, I haven't cleared this with my secretary. I thought that was really fine. It cleared a lot of air because I knew of a prior meeting, and I think Jerry will remember, when Bert Brown, Jim Isbister, I think the administrative officer, I can't remember his name, or the budget officer was there, and I came to Jackson Place to talk about early cooperation. That meeting, I don't think you were in the meeting, Paul.
I know when to stay away from.
Yeah, that was one of those meetings that everybody made nice because everybody had to make nice, but zip happened as a result of that meeting. After the secretary made it clear to all of us, whatever bureaucratic foot dragging was coming from the NIMH side and from higher up in the department, we simply ignored it. It didn't exist. We took shots for it, but then we took shots too from several of you because things weren't moving fast enough. To me, one of the great things that came out of the whole effort was that we were able to impose within the HEW structure a series of what I would call performance contracts and grants, but mostly contracts, where we could say to a state, you do this, we expect the following to happen, you will get 10 cents on the dollar to do it, instead of the HEW rate, which was usually about 35 or 40 cents on the dollar, and you have to report back to us. SAODAP was a wonderful, miserable thing to have. It gave us information. The whole field groaned about it. We got more complaints on that, and it was a very simple system. The unique identifier, the toe print, Jeff, the footprint. Well, it was the big toe, though, that we were really after. We were supposed to let that contract. We got right up to the point of having selected the contractor, and I came downtown and met with Jeff Donfield and, was it LaBert Francis? Yeah, and I said, help me, we are just wasting over $1 million. And I think it was you, Jeff, who took the summation of our meeting and went to Jerry to say, we don't need to do this anymore. But that process was, it's one of those things you remember very well. The other thing that I don't think the people in the SAO ever understood is the disconnect in the government between money and people. When a budget initiative, a supplemental would come through, there would be personnel attached to that supplemental in the documentation, and it would come out of OMB. Now, somehow the money got to the division. The people never showed up till a year or so later. And in the process, there was an assistant to the assistant in the secretary's office and an assistant to the administrator in the administrator's office and somebody in the budget office of NIMH, so that if you gave us 20 positions and we saw 15 a year later, we loved it. We never saw the personnel that was assigned with the dollars that came through the process, no matter how hard everybody worked at it. The fact that OEO was current and in real emergencies could be used. At times, the bureaucracy in HEW simply couldn't do what needed to be done in the time frame. OEO was a more flexible bureaucracy. And then eventually, OEO came during the later years and was integrated into NIMH. And that's one of the wonderful things of government. We were given $20 million in the OEO programs, and their budgets counted $30 million. And it was our problem of who wasn't going to be continued or not. We took care of the problem. There were discontinuations. I have questions about history. In President Nixon's message to the Congress on July 15, 1969, he gives 10 steps to fight the narcotics. And when he gets to rehabilitation, in quotes, he used the phrase substitute drug. Now that's a little before anybody here is talking about memory. Who put the idea, which methadone was the only substitute drug we had, into the president's message at that early point? Pat Moynihan? Okay, because...
He wrote a memo in February before that, 1969, where he started thinking about that, and he would have been the first.
Okay. The other thing that I find curious, and Bob knows this is a particular pet of mine, because we printed 1,500 copies of the Prettyman Commission and sent them to the university libraries around the country. But in 1963, on I think it was the 11th of November, the Prettyman Commission presented a report to President Kennedy. with the subsequent events, that report went out of sight, and besides the law enforcement side of government hated the report. But it asked for 20-some different actions, 25 different actions, including civil commitment and a special assistant for narcotics and drug abuse to the president, and a lot of things that SAO answered. And I have never found anybody who read the Prettyman report before they started the initiatives that came to fruition in 69, 70, and so on. It's like it never existed, and yet there's either in Washington, we're all drinking the same water, or something that by osmosis, these ideas get into our political and our policy thinking. If you have an opportunity to get a hold of a copy of the Prettyman report, it's worth the read just to look at how so much of it, I think it's 25 out of 28 recommendations, saw the light of day over the next decade. The other thing that's interesting to me is if any of you remember Roger Eggeberg, he was on that commission, and he became the administrator of Adamha, and this is what a careerist does. I was asked to be detailed to the administration of Adamha as Roger's deputy, right as NIDA was being formed. And Roger had the title of interim acting administrator. And I was given the title of interim deputy administrator. They did not want us to be comfortable at all in those positions. But you did it, and then go back to your first love, which for me was NIDA. And I appreciate, when I look back on 50 years this year of dealing with drug abuse, that era from about 68 through 75, 76 was absolutely the tops, and has never been the same since.
All right, we're going to go to Dick Bucher. A quick word of introduction. When I was at NTA, we were an orphan in the NTA, in the city government bureaucracy, because we had connections to the White House and the Congress, and every other bureaucrat in the city government hated us. And because of that, they were jealous. And so my office was in the basement of a city government building next to the heating and air conditioning system. And into this basement office came an Air Force colonel one day and said, it appears that you're going to be moving over to the Special Action Office. And that was news to me. And the person who brought the news and helped me make this transition from one place in the government to another is Dick Bucher. And Dick Bucher and I have been friends and colleagues through so many different iterations since that time. And it is a great privilege for me to introduce to you Dick Bucher.
Thank you very much, Bob. First, let me say, and I mentioned this to Karst a little bit earlier, that he sits in my pantheon of heroes in this whole field because, to be very honest with you, at least from my perspective, and I went with Bob out to NIDA and watched the transition from the Special Action Office to NIDA. If Karst hadn't been running interference for us, I'm afraid we would have had an awful lot more rubble than we actually did have. And so, again, Karst, I want to thank you, because it was a very important time. I figured by the time we got down to this, there would probably, everything that I would have thought about saying would have been said, so I have 3 different presentations ready. Well, as it turns out, I can take any one of the 3, because what I'm going to talk about really hasn't been emphasized here. Before I do that, I'd like to take 3 minutes with the chair's permission. First, to bring you greetings and regrets from a fair number of people that I was able to contact in January, in February. Bob Pinko, unable to be here, just completed some major surgery a couple of weeks ago. Ann Ramsey sends her regrets. She really would like to have been here, but she cannot make it. Lee Dogoloff also sends regrets. He's out of the state right now. Barry Brown, Bob Dormer, Deb Hastings-Black, and Chuck and Kathy Yarborough, all asked to be remembered here, and for a variety of reasons couldn't make it. Additionally, I think before we go on, we ought to at least recognize some of the other survivors, those of us who really did make it and made it here. I'm just going to call your name and acknowledge you. And if I miss somebody, somebody quickly step up. John Ball has been referred to on several times, but John was a consultant extraordinaire and a very, very important person. John's sitting back over there to my right. Let's see, as we go on down, two people I want to recognize, Mary Cahill and Kathy Perry Turner in the back. Mary, and I want to especially thank Mary because she actually is responsible for several people getting here. She took it upon herself after I called her. She started calling other people. And both of them were real soldiers in the trenches back in the SAODAP days. Bob Diegelman is here. All right, I was here, but anyway, I wanted to recognize him. He was one of the data men, if you will, and I'll say maybe a word or two about that. Let's see as I'm going down here. Oh, yes, Ralph Howard, where are you? All right. Oh, I'm sorry, Ralph. You're sitting right there. Ralph was a magician. He could make contracts and grants occur, and very, very quickly. And I always, being a student of the bureaucracy, I always admired how he was able to do that and to do it in a very classy way. My friend and colleague Dick Class, who's responsible for me being here right now. Dick and I were colleagues at the Air Force Academy, Department of Political Science, and he had come as a White House fellow, gotten into the OEO work with Don Rumsfeld, as I recall, and when it his time to go, he gave me a call, and I obviously accepted. And let's see, have I missed? I think, no, two more. Oh, I'm sorry, two more. Stuart Nightingale and Charlie Wilson. I beg your pardon, I had them right here. These are two people that had to referee the dollar fight between the states and the cities over a period of time, besides being involved in other things relating to treatment and rehabilitation. And they were just a very, very important part of this particular operation. Now, I think I've gotten everybody. All right, since I've used up most of my time, Bob, I'm still going to take a couple of minutes. I thought since we were talking about legacy, I would take us down a level or two to remind us that things we started, that we have a legacy. I mean, we have a legacy other than just talking about the policy and the momentum. And I just remind you of a few of these. One of them, or a couple of them, have been mentioned already briefly, but let me go ahead and start. We had something called the Treatment Alternatives to Street Crime, which was a very, very important and early attempt to try to do something other than throw people in jail. And it was called TASK. All right, and the taskmaster was Jeff Donfelder, he and his people. Jeff had to go out and help set up these programs, and programs were set up. Now, the interesting thing is that TASK and TASK-like programs continue to this day. I mean, we have that effort still coming out of SAODAP, and we've morphed into something called drug courts, and there are some other things, but very, very important program legacy. I guess that's the point I want to make there. We had the development of several data systems that were and are and remain very, very important. And I'll mention two of them. One was the Drug Abuse Warning Network, which exists today in a little bit of a different form, but it was and is the main what I call the casualty reporting system for the federal government in terms of drug abuse. And it's been modified and upgraded, but it's a very central part of the information that really began with SAODAP and the interest and concern and demands of both Jerry and Bob that we're going to find out what really exists. We're going to develop knowledge, and we're going to get this information out. The other one Karst briefly mentioned was this wonderful animal called the Client-Oriented Data Acquisition Process, CODAP, which was the first time, well, I won't say, was an early attempt to systematically collect information on people in treatment, why they went, when they went, and so on. Now CODAP died. I do have to tell you that, and it died because of a variety of reasons. But like the phoenix, it actually has come out of the ashes as something today called TEDS, which is the Treatment Episode Data Set. Same kind of information. Again, at the beginning, it's the feds that drove it. Today, it's the feds that drive it. We've talked about the Vietnam follow-up study, but there were two other studies, surveys, that I think are worth mentioning. One clearly had its nascence with the Special Action Office, and that was what was then called the National Household Survey on Drug Abuse, now called the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, but it's not the same survey, actually, I can't say that. But it is a survey process that started with SAODAP and continues today. I think and usually it's every year, every October or November, we usually get that particular report. The other one has to do with the what I call the high school survey, Monitoring the Future, which was established at the University of Michigan. SAODAP identified it, if you will, looked at it, said this is something that we think really ought to be continued, and Bob brought it into the fold and got some continuing federal money, federal funding for that. Again, to this day, those two surveys are probably the most important from a policy and program standpoint, or information from which to make decisions. So I want to mention that. 2 minutes, thank you. Alan Green's talked about the pharmacological. I won't worry about that. I'm going to talk about two other things then, and it's going to take 3. First has to do with the presence of a special pleading office in the White House itself. I did some digging, and except for sort of what I call the 3 basic offices there, that is National Defense with the National Security Council, Economics, the Council of Economic Advisors, and others, and maybe Environment. I can't find a special pleader in the White House for social action, for social activities that extended consistently, regularly, and I'll make the argument, without interruption, one way or another, from 1971 until today. And I think that's a pretty strong testimonial to at least the political interest in this particular subject. And finally, and I'm going to take the time, one of the consequences, I believe, one of the consequences of the Vietnam experience was that we may not, what do I want to say? That we may not understand perhaps the unintended consequence. Let me put it that way. Was that experience legitimized drug testing in a manner that I think might have taken a lot longer over a period of time. Now, why am I mentioning that? Because in 1981, when the Department of Defense had its problems and decided they were going to get very, very aggressive to establish a workplace drug testing program, they had some confidence in the process. And indeed, this process worked. As you may or may not know, the Department of Defense program has been, at least in my mind, just truly outstanding. You may remember when the survey came out in 1980, it said about 28% of the young military were using drugs regularly. After the crash on the aircraft carrier Nimitz and the fallout from that, the military established this very aggressive program, And today, consistently, you see drug testing levels, positive levels, below 2%, 1.5%, so on. We saw that program then got transferred to, well, that program. The notion of the value of drug testing as a deterrent got transferred, or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission picked it up, the Department of Transportation picked it up, and so in many ways it drove what we have today as the sort of the core for our workplace drug testing programs. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. I'm going to ask David Musto to be our cleanup hitter at the end, but I want to put Peter Bourne in here and just tell one quick story about Peter's involvement, and that is that when Joseph Tidings lost re-election in 1970, Al Frum went to work for Edmund Muskie in the Senate Intergovernmental Relations Committee, and he wanted to hold hearings on drugs because he knew something about that. And he called me up and said, I need to have a governor. Can you find a governor who can testify about drugs? Well, I had a classmate from college named Peter Bourne, who he and I had worked together, and he had started a drug treatment program in Atlanta under a freshman governor named Jimmy Carter. And so I said to Al Frum, why don't you invite this governor from Georgia? He said, well, who is that? And all this. I said, and when he found he was a Democrat, he was really happy about that idea. So he invited him up, and that visit up to Washington was Jimmy Carter's first visit to Washington. He had never met a leader of the Democratic Party. He met Edmund Muskie on that, who was the person in charge, the chairman of the committee, and it was on that trip that he formed the idea that if Muskie can do it, he can do it, on the basis of that. And when Carter left me, he came to NTA and spent a day. I'd never seen anybody. We had many people visiting the program in those years. I never saw anybody who had such a relationship with the patients in the program as Jimmy Carter did. He was extraordinary, especially with blacks. He had a connection that was just beyond anything I had ever seen in my life. So genuine, the way he did that. It was amazing. But as he left me, he pulled me aside and said he wanted to ask him. He said he was thinking about doing something like this down in Georgia, and he wondered what did I think about Peter Bourne as running this office. And I said, I think that's a really good idea. And when Jimmy Carter was in as president, I was present when Peter Bourne was sworn in the Rose Garden ceremony at the White House. And Jimmy Carter, as president, said, in all the world, the man I'm swearing in now is my best friend. I don't think we've had a drug czar who's had that kind of relationship with the president. He's also, I'm very proud to say, my friend and a person who's contributed greatly to our field, Peter Bourne.
Well, thank you very much. I have the advantage of not knowing before I came here today that I was going to be asked to say anything. So fortunately, I haven't prepared anything, and I just want to touch on a few issues that have been raised that I think to me are of interest. I was kind of interested in Jeff Shepard's talk about the roots of this in law enforcement. And of course, with Bob, that was true too. I got into the addiction field in the early 60s trying to deal with the problem of arrested alcoholics on the streets of Atlanta. And I set up a program where people could either go to the city prison farm or they could be put on antabuse. And it was a dramatically successful program. I mean, we reduced the number of arrested alcoholics by 50% in 1 year. And I became then very enamored of the notion that you could use the compulsive forces of law enforcement and combine them with humanitarian treatment of people and have a very effective outcome. And, viewing it as an either-or thing didn't work, but if you meshed it together, it could be very successful. The second thing is, somebody talked about legacy and impact. I think, Karst, you said this. I mean, what did SAODAP leave as a legacy? And I think he also touched upon the fact that if you were interested in addiction, you were sort of persona non grata at NIMH. Psychiatry really rejected you. Back in those days, there was no interest really in it being part of psychiatry's responsibility. And I think that SAODAP just changed all of that, much more broadly in society as a whole. After SAODAP and what flowed from that, addiction has really been central to concern, not only just here in the US, but all around the world. And knowing that I was coming to this event today, I was just struck looking at the Guardian of London. This is their front page from yesterday, and virtually the entire front page of this story, alcohol worse than ecstasy, the shock new drugs list. There's a whole article about the social consequences of drug abuse and what government should be doing about it. And to me, this 35 years later is a major legacy from SAODAP and what SAODAP started. As Bob mentioned, we were in college together. After I was dealing with alcoholics in Atlanta, I came up here to Walter Reed, and then I was in Vietnam, and then I was at Stanford, and I went back to Atlanta to run an OEO neighborhood health center and started the treatment program for heroin addicts because of what I knew Bob was doing and was aware of what he was doing that was successful here. My program grew, Bob's program grew, and there were a number of other people around the country. The most one who comes to mind most, because he has stuck with it throughout 35 years, is Bob Newman in New York. He was, yes, and he was never in government, but he ran probably the largest program in the country during that period of time. To me, one of the most exciting periods of my life was the periodic meetings that us major drug players had every 3 months or so, where we'd all get together in one of our cities and spend a weekend just talking about our experiences with these big programs. And that continued after I came to SAODAP. And it makes me think that really we were very much in a work in progress during that period of time. Alan Green has alluded to it on the more pharmacological side, but we were looking at the social aspects of all of this and picking up on things like Lee Robbins' study, what you see when you have 20,000 people going through your system every day, and information that was useful to turn into political or social policy was just bubbling up all the time, and we were trying to gather this all together and make sense of it. One of the other things I think is kind of interesting about SAODAP, yes, it came from the executive branch, but its embracement by the legislative branch was really quite unprecedented in terms of it being, from a constitutional standpoint, an intrusion of the legislative branch into the executive branch. And I don't know how many members of Congress were sophisticated enough to sort of understand this opportunity. As few as possible. But it seems to me that here you had a situation where for the first time you had a program at a very high level in the White House, reporting at a very high level to the president, and yet at the same time answerable in terms of being forced to go and testify before Congress. That's why you and Jerry were up there 173 times, and it continued all the way through after SAODAP, even when I was there at ODAP. After SAODAP finished, ODAP was created not from the executive branch, but by the legislative branch saying, this is really nice, we want to continue this, and to have this little insurgency there in the White House. And ODAP was created, but the Gerald Ford people did not implement it. It sort of sat there on the shelf for a year or more. So from that standpoint, I think it's very an interesting innovation. Also, I think this issue of a president with vision and foresight and willingness to look at something different is really important. And bringing that together with really strong, effective professional leadership made SAODAP absolutely crucial. The mix, the chemistry, the equation was totally correct and very, very unusual. I may antagonize the maximum number of people with this, but I compare it very much with what happened with HIV/AIDS, which to me was a total disaster. It was a similar opportunity, but was not picked up on. I think the political leadership was totally intimidated by both the right and the left, and I think there was not sufficient professional leadership to do the kind of things that Jerry Jaffe and Bob DuPont were willing to do. So I think there was you can contrast the two together and say SAODAP really worked for these reasons, and the HIV/AIDS program completely failed, and tens of thousands of people died as a result. I think we were in some ways lucky to have the opportunity to focus really on one form of drug addiction initially. We had heroin and we had a way of dealing with it, and I think that made it very effective. We had the criticism, I think the criticism, one part of the criticism that I think was made worse was that as methadone kind of took off and people acknowledged that it worked, one of the other problems that there was that there were a lot of entrepreneurial people who saw it as a way of making a whole lot of money. And they got out there and they ran bad programs that were mismanaged, and that only backfired then on the good programs, everything that had been done to get methadone accepted. Finally, I just want to say something about what happens in a business setting or any other setting where you have dynamic visionary entrepreneurs. You create something that is enormously successful, but the people who create it often are not the people to institutionalize it. And if something is to be sustained and the impact is to be maintained, or in a business, the business goes on being successful, you have to find a way to institutionalize it in some permanent kind of way. I think much of the time during Bob's leadership, this was one of the challenges, and it was that he was able to work with cost, and that Bob himself went to take over NIDA that made this possible. I think it could have gone all badly wrong in my estimation. If that had not been worked out, SAODAP would have been a flash in the pan and there would have been no lasting legacy. But there was, and I think, you know, in Jerry and Bob, we have sort of the two bookends. Jerry, whose genius made SAODAP happen, and Bob's genius was in making it sustainable in the long run and a permanent asset to the country. Thank you.
Imagine what that guy could have done if we told him last night he was going to be speaking. Next, we've got the Dean of Historians in the field, who was with us all from the beginning and has been with us ever since. And it's my privilege to introduce to you David Musto.
Well, thank you very much. And I just wanted to say that in relation to Karst's question, in the appendix to my book that I did with Pam Korsmeyer, we take all the Prettyman recommendations and trace them out from there on. So.
And I've got the copy of that book back there. You can look it up and make sure what David said.
Well, I would also say that extensively quoted are about 80% of the people in this room. So you might want to look at the index. It's amazing what people say, and in print. So anyway, I would just want to say, well, also something General Guard said reminded me that during Peter's era, I was asked to go to Germany to look into the deaths at our Berlin Brigade from heroin. And I met with the top general in charge of health and medicine at that time. And he said when he was younger, they were going in a boat over to Korea in the Korean War, and they were told that the North Koreans took all kinds of drugs. They just couldn't be stopped by shooting them, and they were scared to death. And he said, now we've got an opportunity here with the Russians. Don't say we're stopping drugs, just say everyone's on drugs. That'll scare them. And he didn't quite mean it, but and then the question how I got into this was completely by accident, and again it reminds me of something General Guard was saying, that sometimes it's an advantage, I think, to enter into something which you have no preconceived notions. I had no interest in the history of drugs until one morning, Stan Yolis, I was a special assistant, called me in and he said, Musto, I see that you've published these articles on history. And I said, yes. And he said, well, every time I recommend to Congress that they give heroin to heroin addicts, someone from the Narcotics Bureau stands up and says, the AMA considered that in 1919 and rejected it. And I don't have a comeback. You go downtown, find out why the AMA opposed it, and don't tell anybody, and we're going to be ready for them the next time this happens. So I went downtown to the Library of Congress and the National Archives and found boxes after boxes, hundreds, dealing with how we got our drug laws. And essentially, it had not been consulted because for historians, this was not a very desirable area to study, apparently. And but I found it fascinating, and I looked upon, and I still look upon, drug policy, drug problems, drug imagery as all part of American social history. And for that, in that way, I find it quite interesting. So then, how did I get involved with SAODAP? Well, Jerry called me one day. He said he wanted me to come down and go over the national strategy with a fine-tooth comb, mainly to see if there were any errors in the history of the thing. And I did. The only thing that was kind of interesting about it was that I was sitting there looking at the manuscript, but Jerry standing right behind me in the shoulder. And every time I made a mark in the margin, he'd say, well, why did you do that? And finally we got it worked out, and I moved to another room. Anyway, I want to say that my general impression of the drug abuse field and the money devoted to the drug abuse area is a great pain in the side of normal budgetary processes. And I have gotten the impression, you may be in a better position than I am to comment on this, but I get the impression that people just wish it would go away, and because it interferes with the normal budget process for health and so on. And here's this big thing that comes in here with a lot of public support often. The government throws money at it, and then there isn't some for the next year, and so you know all those problems. But that distorts things, and I have had the feeling that over time that the budgetary people you have to talk to and deal with really wish this difficulty would just fade away. Would want to say something about Mr. Nixon. I only met him once, and I know how he took the position that there should be treatment, and he did provide a lot of treatment and so on. But my own one time of meeting Mr. Nixon, it wasn't the way he described things. He had just announced he was going to China. It was at the National Republican Governors, and I had been invited to speak to them. And I did speak to them, and I was very impressed because as I looked out across the room in which the governors were meeting, there were about, I would say, 70 newsreel cameras facing every possible thing. And I thought, well, they are going to pay attention to what I say. Well, there's no evidence anywhere that I ever was there, which I found kind of disappointing. But then I think it was Danny Friedman who wanted me to meet Nixon. And so I waited and he came and he introduced, and Danny said, this is Dr. Musto, and he's involved with drug policy, I guess. And Mr. Nixon replied, he says, well, there's only one thing to do, you've got to kick him. And he started kicking as he walked away, which if you think about it, it's hard to walk in a particular direction and kick at the same time. But he did it. And so that's the only advice that I got from Mr. Nixon. But I know that he felt differently on this, but it was what he said. He had a great trouble with Bert Brown. He called him that clown Brown. And if you ever look at this book I did, you'll see a lot of documentation of the problems between Mr. Nixon and HEW in general, but particularly Bert Brown and NIMH. And I think that one of the most interesting things to do is to compare the full texts of the Bert Brown statement, which was called the HEW response, and Jerry's recommendations of what to do. And they are, and you know, that debate that goes on between those two documents is active today. It's really the debate between harm reduction and what else. And it's fascinating to see that there are these two themes in American society in dealing with health and drugs that never go away. One will be dominant at one time or another, but they just don't go away. Now, what I've found very interesting in retrospect, now we know that there was a growing intoleration of drugs in the 1970s, partly through the Monitoring the Future studies and other things. And it reached a peak about 1980, and then there's been generally a decline. And so what fascinated me and what led to this book is wondering, how do you handle, from a policy point of view, a problem which is only going to get probably worse no matter what you do? And how do you handle this politically? And I think that I've always had the feeling, although I know some don't agree, that that the idea of a single drug czar was appealing to Congress because the agency heads couldn't keep pointing at each other. There'd be one person they could get on the carpet and complain about. So the legislative were very happy with this prospect, and that's why they put it in. And the executive often was not so keen on that because they felt more vulnerable to it. I also I wonder about the effect on 9/11/73 when Mr. Nixon said that we had turned the corner on drug abuse. What was that effect? What effect did that have on the drug abuse group that was involved in trying to do things? And did this later on be seen as something that wasn't correct or wasn't true? I would say, and also I think maybe in just ending this, the white paper of 1975, which was in the Ford administration, is a very important document. It really represents the inner feelings of a lot of people who were brought in under the Nixon administration, but chafed under the lack of flexibility on some of these. For example, as the white paper said, they wanted to minimize drug use, whereas Mr. Nixon was not interested in words like minimize. They were going to wipe out drug abuse. And so, either because of the rhetoric or whatever, when the white paper came, it was like sort of a relaxation and the introduction of a number of moderation, of minimization, and so on. I really wonder about that, and I know there are a lot of people here who know more about it than I do, and I'd be very interested in what they have to say. The extinction of SAODAP, I think, came from the Ford hesitation to identify himself with the drug issue in the way that Nixon had been identified. He only had 2 years to really create a new image, and I think that he was very hesitant about going in the direction of, well, for example, putting someone in the White House that could be attacked, and then the White House is attacked. I suspect that's the case. Yes.
David, it's interesting that Ford, my recollection, was one of the 6 who proffered an amendment that we beat back not to have a sunset provision, which was fascinating.
But he wasn't president then.
No, he was minority leader.
Yeah, right.
And our argument was, look, you know, there's concern, and I suggested unreasonably so, of the concentration of power. You need to have the sunset provision, and I can remember Springer from Illinois saying, and the types of people that you'll get when you have a limited office and limited years are people who come in, think hard, be creative, and not want a career in government. But it was interesting that when Ford was wearing the hat of congressman, there was the focus on the sunset. I think the sunset provision was a critical aspect of getting that through, because the Congress didn't have to deal with that ad infinitum.
Yes, no, I agree with you. And I think also Dick Parsons and Bob and others wrote many memos to the president trying to encourage him to establish this office, but he just wouldn't do it. And it wasn't established essentially until Peter came in. So I have spoken for less than 10 minutes, or about 10 minutes. Yeah, okay, and I want to at least establish a record in that area. Thank you.
Thank you, David. There was talk about the experience of when following the president and the lights going out. I had the experience in the Nixon White House of speaking in the East Room of the White House to a national press conference, and the president spoke just before I did. And as soon as the president stepped away, all the lights went out, all the cameras were off, all the reporters left, and I was left for the rest of the day to speak to as few people who were there. And as I rose to the podium, my first words out of my mouth were, "Back to reality." And to me, what that meant was no press around. But it almost cost me my job, because it was in the middle of the the Watergate crisis. And it was thought to be disrespectful of the president. And it taught me a lesson about how scary it is to speak in the White House. You can get in a lot of trouble very quickly. Well, we're going to have our discussion, but before I do, I want to salute 2 other people. We've had a lot of people identified here. But there are 2 people here who have not been identified, who have been central to this event, who have been behind the scenes in 2 ways. One is the people who are behind Jerry and me, and second, behind this meeting. And that is Faith Jaffe. Is she here? Yes. Faith, stand up. And my wife, Helen DuPont. Helen, stand up. As Paul and Jerry and I know, this event would not be happening without what they did. And I'm not talking about just a little bit of effort in it, but a tremendous amount over a long period of time. Now, I'm going to go until 6 with the discussion. So what I would like to do is have, you all have noticed that the camera changed locations. The camera was over here at the side, and the camera is now in the center. And this is a response to a discussion I had with Jeff Shepard. And that is that we are all speaking not just for ourselves, although that's very important, but also to make a record of something that is a very, very special event and really very important. And so I wanted to make sure that the camera is in the center, and I want to make sure that the speakers speak to the camera, because we want to make sure this is recorded. And I feel that way about the questions. So I'd ask the people who have questions to come on up and maybe stand over here in a sort of standby way, and I'll get the microphone, so you got a microphone so you can have. And I'm very happy. I don't think 10 minutes would be good to speak, but I'm happy to have you make a statement as well as a question to be part of what we're doing, because I'm very sensitive to what John Ball said, that David Musto said to me, and that is that the people in the audience have testimony that is extremely important to what we're doing. So who would like to start us off in the discussion commentary? Jeff, you had something you wanted to say? Go ahead.
The reason Bob lets me come up here and speak is he mentioned earlier, when he was in charge, I was the one at the White House, and I thought I'd clarify that just for a second. Jeff Donfeld was full-time drug treatment, and his boss, Bud Krogh, on the Domestic Council, had lots of responsibilities. He was in charge of general government. When I joined the staff, I was in charge of law enforcement. Working for Bud after 1972, Bud went to the Department of Transportation. I took his place, so I was in charge of general government. When I left in the beginning of the Ford administration, Dick Parsons took my place in charge of general government. So what you had was a succession of 3 people as associate directors of the Domestic Council. I was also sitting there musing about why it was that there was so much White House involvement and what really changed. We'd had national domestic problems before, and I just wanted to take a second to suggest what I think may have contributed to this. In June of when Nixon was first elected, he appointed something called the Ash Council that was chaired by Roy Ash, and included John Connolly and Walter Thayer, who was Dean of Harvard Business School, and Walter Thayer was in charge of a consulting firm, and George Baker was in charge of Harvard Business School. And one of the things they recommended in modernizing the executive branch was the consolidation of domestic policy making into the White House itself, modeled on the National Security Council. The National Security Council was created in 1949 when the Pentagon was created and the armed services were reorganized, and it was in the executive branch. Well, the Ash Council said you had to do the same thing on domestic issues, create the Domestic Council, and you ought to take the old Bureau of the Budget and hold in the executive office of the presidency these people responsible for management. So the reorganization plan number 2 of 1970, which became effective in June, created the Domestic Council and changed the old Bureau of the Budget to the Office of Management and Budget. And that was the basis for the White House exercising policy authority. SAODAP is one of the most fantastic successes, and I think a result of that, the people and a result of the Domestic Council ability to commit presidential time and attention. There were some other ones that fit in that same category, and just not to detail them, but just to mention, there was an equally dramatic shift in federal government policy toward the American Indian that occurred for roughly the same reasons under the same auspices. It would be fair to say the environment and the coordination, the creation of EPA, and the huge response of the government to the environment was aided because of the Domestic Council. It's possible, it's just not my area, but I think the energy crisis, the response to the energy crisis was helped by that. We had an energy czar. This was a big mobilization. I'm still musing by the comment about why HIV didn't evoke that same thing, because it had the same characteristics. I mean, it was a huge national crisis, very political, and very mishandled. There's just no question about that. But I wanted to make those comments. I appreciate Bob and the opportunity to let other people have time to decide what to say.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Why don't you step up here? Just step right there.
Well, when I accepted your gracious invitation to join you, I didn't realize how much my life and career has been affected by the people in this room. So I want to just say a few things about that. I didn't prepare anything in advance. I was a graduate student in psychology at Washington University in St. Louis, and I was an NIMH drugs and addiction trainee, and I had to, as part of that, do a research practicum. So I remember I asked a few people, who should I go work with in the drug area? And they said, go over to the medical school and work with Lee Robbins. And I kept hearing Lee Robbins, so I said, I'll go find him. I had a lot to learn. I remember sitting down with her and grilling her as to why I should want to work with her. Lee was actually, I was told, that she was introduced to a very great audience once by Norval Morris as a social scientist without peers. And what I can tell you, I have never in my life, I've been in this field now for almost 30 years, I've never in my life seen someone who could do research like she could and look at an output of data and just weave the interpretations that none of the rest of us mortals could find. And I have immense respect for her. As you may know, she designed a classic follow-up study that has set the tone for all of us that came after. She followed up 93% of the people, of the representative sample of everyone who left Vietnam in September 71. And by George, when no one believed the results, or they were skeptical of the results, that this large group of people who had become addicted to heroin came home and seemed to remit, regardless of whether they had treatment. They said, you didn't study them long enough. So she went and followed them up 2 years later, and again got 93% response rate and found similar things. By the way, Dr. Rumi Price at Washington University is now following them up some 30 years later. And she has some publications you may want to look up on this and how well they're doing. I wanted to share with you one of the anecdotes that we used to talk about in our little research group with Lee. She would say, one of the people we interviewed told us that when he arrived in Vietnam and came down from the plane, a soldier ran up to him and offered to trade drugs for his clean urine. So, Jerry, you are much too humble. I can tell you in some of the material that I have that Lee has written, she has basically talked about how ingenious you were to come up with the drug testing before people left Vietnam. And your desire to leave for posterity the findings of a failed experiment. This was an incredible failed experiment where people who normally wouldn't use heroin was put in a heroin-saturated environment. And many of them used, and then they came back, and they looked okay. I would request maybe, if you have a few minutes, to put this on the record for Lee, because you know she isn't too well right now. It would be nice. She wouldn't write why you chose her. And it would be nice to get on the record why you chose her to do the study. One more thing I want to say, and then please do answer that. I've sort of had an easy career just taking Bob DuPont's vision and running with it. So the arrestee drug testing program that he started in the early 70s, was it April 1st, 1970, still goes on and is probably one of the best ways of tracking drug trends in this high-risk group. And I was able to take his idea, try it out in Manhattan, and then go to the Justice Department to start the DUF program with drug use forecasting, which later became ADAM, which was a system for tracking drug use in offenders and gave the country a new way of measuring drug use, and it was all based on what you do. So I owe a debt of gratitude to all of you. And Jerry.
Eric said some very nice things about Lee, but they were well-deserved. She is without peer. I selected Lee because I asked Danny Friedman who could do this job, and he mentioned Lee. I called her, she took on the job. But I think I ought to say something else. Getting that data was high risk. We had no idea that it would look that good. That the relapse rate would be that low. None whatsoever. However, and the military was equally reluctant, maybe they were just more cautious. The fact is that when we came back to San Clemente, the president said, you will do this. I took it as an order. And every time we ran into roadblocks, at the Pentagon or any place else, David Nurko was our front man there, and he said, we're having this problem. I said, tell them that if necessary, they'll get a call from the Oval Office on this one, because I was absolutely determined that we would get the data and we would report on it, because that's what the president wanted. So there's an issue of, when you get a direct order, if it's legal, you should carry it out. And this is one. This is one, and we did run into those roadblocks, but we removed them, and we got the data. But I need to clarify one other thing. Lee did not follow all the people who came back in September. Only the high-risk group were from a sergeant down in the Army, not Navy, not Air Corps. So people are always wondering about the discrepancies between the urine tests that we reported and the data that she found. And discrepancies have to do that there were somewhat different populations. To save money, because we didn't have that much money, we were still operating under the executive order. We did not have a budget. We scraped that money together. To make it effective, we focused on the Army enlisted men, which where the positives were. So, may explain some of the science as well. But anyway, thanks, sir.
Okay, somebody else. John, come on up.
Well, it's great to be here with so many friends. Some have already left, but it's great to feel that we've shared so much together over many years. Early on, someone said, well, how did you get started in all of this? And I would be remiss, I think we'd all be remiss if we didn't say a few words about before 1971. Now, I started in the field in 1962, where I went to the Addiction Research Center. I'm a professor, criminologist, and the Addiction Research Center was a remarkable place. It was just research. That was a weakness in a sense and a strength. It was a strength in that I never was with a better research group, and the accomplishments of the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky. We had 100,000 addicts at the Lexington and Fort Worth hospitals. So it was a remarkable opportunity to do research. And since we were down in Kentucky, I'll come back to that in just a second, we were very fortunate. We were away from Washington, so nobody bothered us. And that was a big advantage. We all knew that. And we also had unusual directors. Harris Isbell is one of the three best people I ever worked with. He said, my job is to keep Washington off your back, to let you do research, and to support you. So that, I think, is very important, and I could spend at least an hour here talking about all that was accomplished at Lexington. But that's all part of behind us. So we built on all of that in the Special Action Office. And I also think we'd be remiss not to mention that Vincent Dole was there before us and pioneered a lot with regard to methadone maintenance treatment. I said I worked for three extraordinary people. One was Harris Isbell, the other was Jerry Jaffe, and the third was Bob DuPont. So I want to end by talking about the last two. Why it was so great doing research, which is a special way of looking at the world, in the Special Action Office, was that Jerry Jaffe and Bob DuPont both understood research, and not in an abstract way. I would go with a project, or they would present me with a project. They were receptive to new ideas, and they supported them. And in terms of support, I also should mention administration and someone like Ralph Howard. In the Special Action Office, we were in a situation that was almost unique in the world. I could get $1 million grant out in 7 days. And what would happen is I'd get an idea, maybe check with either Jerry Jaffe or Bob DuPont, whoever it might be, and I would be the originating officer, get a project officer, and then ship it up to Ralph Howard. And Ralph Howard and his people would put it through all the paces in terms of administration. Well, that is quite extraordinary to be able to do that, and it resulted in a lot of accomplishments in the 1 year I was there. And Dick Bucher mentioned some of them, but we did a tremendous amount of work getting data systems going, the Dawn and many others, and the national surveys, all of this. All of these were done because of Jerry Jaffe and Bob DuPont, who supported research and understood it. The other part, when we talk about policy, is not just the research and getting the results. The other part is the media, getting support and attention through the media, because if you go to Congress, as Paul well knows, you have to have support. And of course, that's another big story of how you get support through the newspapers, television, all the rest. I found the life in the Special Action Office a world when I tried to explain it as I went back every weekend back home to Philadelphia to my wife. I'd say, you can't believe what happened this week in the Special Action Office. Every week was unbelievable, and in many cases things you couldn't attribute to publication. But it was quite extraordinary to be able to do all of these tasks, and so it was a golden opportunity. And I think I kept thinking about what you could almost call research development, which Washington is preoccupied with much of the time. How can you get first-class original research going? Now, we need the bureaucracy. You can't do away with it. But you also need some special places where research is supported. That was the Special Action Office, was the Addiction Research Center. So I've been very lucky. Thank you.
I wonder if I might ask Stuart Nightingale to step up here. I see he's reluctant to come up, but Stuart has had a very special role as a scientist, as a physician, and has also had a perspective on this that nobody else in the room has, and that is his many years of government service at the FDA afterwards to put this all in perspective. And I'm very eager to hear what Stuart Nightingale has to say.
Well, thank you, Bob. Of course, I can't refuse this opportunity. And actually, I do have a few things to say about the legacy of the Special Action Office, and I think rather unusual in certain aspects. One is that I did work at the FDA for many years after leaving NIDA, and Peter Bourne and Jerry actually started two interagency committees at the Special Action Office that, until I left the FDA in about 2000, were still extant. So they were started in the Special Action Office, and they continued in the bureaucracy. So in a way, that was a legacy, a very important legacy, and the reason was what the substance of the two committees were. The first was the Interagency Committee on Methadone Policy, and it followed the whole methadone maintenance evolution and development within the government. As things occurred, there was always a need to work out problems that occurred, whether it's sort of delivery issues, new regulations to update the earlier methadone regulations. And it was primarily DEA, FDA, and NIDA initially. And these were, I would say, three agencies that didn't necessarily always get along together in the best way. But you had a forum that was established by the White House that was, even though the White House was no longer involved in this, and there was not involvement by the drug czars that followed in this. They were really handled at the level of the standard bureaucracy, and it really did quite well. That was one committee. The other committee was the Interagency Committee on Drug Control, and that was primarily involved in drug scheduling issues. which again was contentious, and there weren't always agreement between NIDA, FDA, and DEA. In fact, I would say in that area it was even more contentious because of the issue about physicians misprescribing and at what point did you get into areas that really were criminal behavior. And again, that was extant up to at least to 2000 after I left. So two very important committees continued after being established. And I was actually chair at the Special Action Office of those committees, and I certainly served as chair when I was at NIDA and FDA for many years, at least for the Methadone Policy Review Board. Now, so that was, I think those are important legacies. The other is the issue of how you take a drug like methadone, which, although was approved at the time for pain relief, was not approved for narcotic addiction treatment. And you heard earlier about the comments that there was a hybrid IND NDA which allowed it to be used. But in point of fact, the very widespread use of methadone as really still technically and legally an investigational drug, no matter what you called it, because the NDA didn't come, the approval didn't come till later, actually set the stage for many other important actions the government took later on. And I can, again, look at this from the FDA perspective. And that is the treatment IND was established by regulation at FDA in about 1985. And it really was a direct outgrowth of the concept of being able to take something that hasn't been approved by FDA as being safe and effective for the specific indication, but there's evidence there that it may be effective, it's the best treatment there is, and therefore it has to be used. So how do you use it? Well, the treatment IND was that mechanism, although you still had to get informed consent for it, so there were some problems. Then in the Persian Gulf War in '91, there was a need to provide the troops with two drugs, or a drug and a biologic, that were the most important protectant for the troops. They were not approved by FDA, so we devised a regulation which allowed use with a waiver of informed consent under certain specific conditions. And that was actually, it was utilized, it was very valuable. It was subsequently withdrawn for various reasons. And then after 9/11, the same issue about how do you make something which you have to use but hasn't gotten final FDA approval, what mechanisms can there be? There was new legislation for something called the Emergency Use Authorization, which obviously was geared towards bioterrorist events and now even pandemic influenza as potential uses. But you have to be able to take a drug no matter what else is going on. It may not be fully approved by FDA. You've got to have a mechanism to do it. So really a lot of the thinking and the work that was done at the Special Action Office, I think, led to important work later on. And this, you could refer to what happened there with methadone as being the initial approach to this, and widespread use of a drug which has not been approved either ever as a drug or not approved for that indication. So, thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Just, we got somebody else who'd like to step up before you get drafted? I just mentioned one other name to follow up on comments that several people have made, John Ball and Karst in particular, and that's Jack O'Donnell, who was an extraordinary intellect and human being. I know when I was head of NIDA, I would come to work a lot of times and see a list of people I was going to be seeing, and it wasn't the highest priority for me to see whatever this was that was on that list. But if Jack O'Donnell was on the list, that would make me happy for a week or more, because he was really interested in learning, and he had a vast fund of knowledge. He was fun to be around and just fun to watch the way he thought about things. I think he brought something to epidemiology, a little bit like Lee Robbins did, that was just extraordinary, beyond what other people have done. Do we have anybody else who wants to step up here?
Can I make another comment?
Yes, Karst, come on.
First, a quick note on Jack O'Donnell. He's the man who convinced me to make a career out of the Public Health Service. He was my first supervisor. And if you want to see the first what I consider raising of the bar in a follow-up study. Read the Kentucky follow-up. It gave him 2 heart attacks, and it gave me an opportunity to do field research, but it is a very interesting volume. He's entirely responsible for it, the idea and writing it up. We talk about the transition from SAO and then over to NIDA. And one of the trickiest parts, and one that gave, I think, both Bob and I many hours of discussing, was how we were going to interlace the 2 staffs. And it wasn't easy, because there were these 7-day grants never happened in HEW. It's a 9 to 14 month cycle, if you want to know the truth. So you have people coming with a experience and a mental attitude that I can get it done now, and they run into John Spain, the grant manager, whose first word out of his mouth is no. No matter what, it doesn't matter what you ever ask John, the first word was no, but, and then we went on from there. And I think it's a credit, particularly if you look at the division level. Stu, you worked with Lois Chatham. Lee Dogeloff worked with Robbie Roberton. The combination of people from NIDA and from SAO and how it went together. In fact, I don't know if you still have the memo. I do. I wrote a memo to Bob when the idea that NIDA was going to be formed, and common wisdom was, or question was I going to stay incumbent in the deputy's job? Now, I was a commission officer. All Bob had to do was make one statement to the administrator, and I would get a competent order. I was gone. So it wasn't a, for instance, and we really didn't know each other until you came to SAO. And
one thing I did know was how much I needed you.
Oh, okay.
There was never any doubt in my mind at that point, and I've never wavered. That
But-
was one of the better decisions.
But this was, I mean, frankly, this was the concern of everybody at NIDA. Where are we going to fit in this thing? And I think the process we went through, we had all hands, and then we had another mechanism that I've never seen brought into the public. How many of you know what a dupigram is? If you worked at NIDA, you know what a dupigram is. This man cannot stay off a typewriter in that era, probably the computer now, and daily would send out at least a dozen questions throughout the organization, bypassing all the channels of command and going to the particular scientist he wanted to talk to. And so we got his secretary, Helen, or was it? Yeah, Helen, to make up a special form, and it was titled Dupigram. She would collect these, duplicate them. We would put them in a binder so we knew what he was doing in communicating with staff. And also then when we had our weekly staff meetings with the divisions, to remember for them to, now you got this question asked, when's the answer coming back? But the one thing I will say for Bob, he had an endless number of questions, and at times that binder was 3 and 4 inches thick with traffic going on inside the Institute. But it was one of the things that brought everybody in the Institute knew that the director was interested in what they were doing, all the way down into the branches and sections. I think this was a real help in getting us together.
I'm going to bring us to an end. I want to, for this part of our presentation, I want to just mention a couple of other names that I want to be sure are on the record. And you've heard a little bit about it. When I had the opportunity to suggest to Jeff Donfeld where he might go in terms of looking for help in dealing with the White House activities, I sent him to Jerry Jaffe, and that was, the rest is history. But the other place I sent him was to see Vincent Dole and Marie Neisweiner. And I think it's hard to think about what's happened to all of us without thinking about the two of them and their contributions. There you go. I've seldom known people like the two of them, and the effect they had for the good in our country is just hard to overstate. I know when I got NTA going, one of the most convincing things I did was to have Vince Dole come down and talk to the mayor and the leaders in the city, and he was just, you couldn't be around him without knowing that this was a person of great integrity and great wisdom. I mean, he was the opposite of somebody who was running a game on you. He was a person who had tremendous credibility, and Marie was, of course, his secret weapon. She was just fabulous, and what a great team they were. Now, you've heard, I had no idea when we got started with this, or even when I came here this morning, or the early afternoon, what was going to happen. It never occurred to me that this was the Bob and Jerry show. I didn't think about that at all. But some of you have been very generous, overly generous about Jerry's and my contributions. But I want to say, first of all, how much we depended on so many other people. There was a whole movement. There was a whole group of people. Peter was talking about a group of people who got together, and Bob Newman was a big leader in this, but there were many, many other people. And it was a wonderful, wonderful group of people. And as Carr said, I never in my life, before or after, had that kind of sense of a group of people who were bonded together, who had an awareness at the time that what we were doing was more important than us. It was more important than who we were. It was something that, a contribution we could make, not individually, but together. And it was just a fabulous, fabulous experience. Now, there were a lot of people who helped. I'm just talking about, for example, how the newspapers here in town were so important to me at a particular moment. And there were lots of other people, lots of people up on the Hill. But I want to talk about three people who are here, without whom none of this would have happened. And that is the three people from the White House. Bud Krogh was the leader of the gang, Jeff Shepard, and Jeff Donfeld. It was extraordinary, and I don't know any other example like this, where people who had that kind of authority, that kind of role, who reached out to people, who could help move something forward and provide that kind of leadership at that level. Without that kind of access, none of this would have happened. Stuart was talking about and several people talked about the methadone regulations. Those would not have happened without the president saying, that's the way it's going to be. This is what we're going to do. That's an extraordinary thing. And what the president did was rely on these very young men who were clearly motivated. You know, there was no question, are you a Democrat or a Republican? I don't remember anybody ever caring about that. It was, can you move the ball down the field? Can you help us move the ball down the field? And I want to make a special point with all of you of thanking the three of them. And the fact that they're here today tells you how important what went on then was to them, and that they're still involved in what's going on in the field. So please join me in a round of applause for the three of them. I want to end with one last. What?
You should ask Jerry and Paul to join you at the podium so we can thank you directly.
No, wait a second. Let me take one other point at the end. We'll do that. We'll get all three of them up here. Okay, all three of us up here. I want to tell one other story from, and gosh, it's hard to pick one, but this is one it comes from my heart. When I started NTA, I hadn't spent a lot of time with addicts. I'm a psychiatrist. I did that kind of work. But I felt I needed something more in terms of understanding the culture, if you will. And I put together a group of what I called my ex-addict advisory team. And I had about 15 guys who were about my age, roughly, who had been through heroin addiction and who were not using. And they were my advisors, and I met with them pretty much every week for 3 years. A lot of time I spent with those guys. And they were constantly bringing me back information, and they'd comment on what we were doing and what happened in the media, and they did all kinds of things in a very informal way because they didn't have any positions. It wasn't a job title, but they were all working together at NTA. And by the way, Lee Dogeloff was absolutely central to all of that. He was my deputy, and fabulous contributions he's made, and he would like to be here, but as Dick Bucher said, he's in Arizona. Anyhow, I cared a lot about these guys, and there was a real closeness there. And over the years, I kind of lost track of what was going on. And one of them was a fellow named Nap Turner. Some of you may have heard of him. He became something of a celebrity in the local area. He was a blues singer and a saxophone player, and kind of had a career on the radio. But he was a real classy guy. He'd been sentenced to St. Elizabeth's for a period of time because of his heroin addiction, and had been through quite a lot, and came out. And he'd gone to work at NIDA and worked in the government for a while. And then it came time for our friend Barry Brown had worked with us too from NTA and then at NIDA. Barry was retiring, and Nap Turner came to the retirement party. And so we were just talking, and I was talking about where were the other guys from the advisory committee. What was the story about them? So we went down the name. This one is dead, that one is dead, this one is dead. And I said, well, where are they all? What happened to them all? Well, they had not relapsed to heroin, but they had almost all died of alcoholism. And a couple of them died of lung cancer from smoking, but mostly it was alcohol. And I thought, gosh, we were talking about heroin as this one drug. Methadone was a drug to treat heroin. It never occurred to me that the fate would be that alcoholism would take them. And so I said to Knapp, I said, I don't get it, Knapp. How come you're here and they're gone? And he said, Bob, don't you understand that? You don't know the answer to that? I said, no, I really don't know the answer to that. And he said, well, this is the way it worked out. I went to meetings and they didn't. I said, what do you mean? He said, I went to AA meetings. And I was part of that program. And they didn't do that. And I was stunned. And I guess if I were to think about the one thing that I didn't know in 1973 or 76 that I think I do know now, it's how important those programs are. Not to get to stopping. Stopping is not what the addicts have a problem with. Stopping is easy. As Mark Twain said about cigarette addiction, it's the easiest thing in the world. He'd done it 1,000 times. Every addict has stopped drug use 1,000 times. That's no problem. The challenge is staying stopped. That's a really big problem. And what had happened to these folks is they had gone on to the alcohol. And one of the things about AA and NA is that they're not substance specific. It's not a heroin treatment program is what we were running. They treat them all as one problem. So to get well, you've got to stop not just alcohol, or not just heroin, but alcohol too, or cocaine, or marijuana. God, we'd turn a blind eye to that in all of those years. And they don't in those programs. So I guess if I would say one thing that I didn't know then that I do know now is how important it is, and it pleases me at this point in my life, to think that those programs are completely free. And they're available to anybody. And so if you want to get well and stay well, there are those meetings. And I've had the benefit of having some very rich patients later in my life who are addicts. And what's kind of fun about it is they go to exactly the same meetings as my poorest patients from NTA. That those programs are completely democratic. And what's interesting about the rich ones is how much they enjoy being with the poor ones at the meeting. It's the only thing they do where everybody's on an equal footing. So that's something that I just pass on. Let me ask Paul and Jerry to come up here and join me and thank all of you. We're going to get together again at dinner. We come up here and stand with this group.
Can I say one more thing?
Please. And Paul, say one more thing.
You spoke about Jack O'Donnell, and John Ball spoke about getting large contracts through. Well, one of the contracts that was put through was for Jack O'Donnell to do a study called Young Men and Drugs. Now, why was that done? It's because we knew about the distinction between incidence and prevalence, which is very hard to get across. One of the people who understood it completely was Richard Nixon. Very, very astute. And the point I'm trying to make here is that sometimes being smarter than everybody else gets you into trouble. Because we showed them data from NTA of the incidence of heroin. It's published, as you know, in a number of places, showing the drop-off from 71 dropped sharply down in 72. The number of new initiates dropped further down in 73. It's clear that if the number of new cases is going down, the epidemic technically is over the hump. And we had this data from other places as well. But there were other scientists who were saying we're faking this, we're deceiving people. Well, there were others. There were other things continuing, but we wanted to find out how common that was, that in fact the number of new cases was actually dropping for the country as a whole. And in fact, the data that he brought back suggested that it was, which is why you allowed the president to say we've turned the corner. The difficulty is the public doesn't know the difference between incidence and prevalence. What they knew is the number of addicts wasn't dropping. Even the number of new addicts was, in fact, dropping fairly sharply. And all the data subsequently, demonstrates that we were right about that. Unfortunately, when the number of new cases of a chronic disorder are dropping, the number who have the disorder at any given time is not dropping quite so sharply unless they get cured or they die or something of that sort. So, you raised the question, David, why did he say that? We've turned the corner? Because we had. And he knew it when we were talking about incidence. And he knew it was incidence and not prevalence. Unfortunately, maybe Bob and I and Richard Nixon were the only people who fully realized that. And it made everybody angry, not so much because, it was wrong. Many people knew it was right. They're saying, well, what's going to happen to our budget? That is exactly what happened. That what's going to happen to our budget? And but I just wanted to say for the record that he understood it. Unfortunately, some people understood it very well, and some people didn't want to understand it. Anyway, so much for that. But that was what Jack O'Donnell found in this nationwide study.
Just take a minute to reference and perhaps underscore the apolitical nature of an incident that occurred. And I'm sure that Jeff doesn't remember this, but I found it in my lawyer's notes. What was not mentioned here today is that, among other things that were done by Bob and Jerry, is the publication of a national strategy on drug abuse. And as those of us who know and love Jerry dearly, a national strategy could not be written unless he was the original draftsperson. There were some of us who intervened, as Dick and others know, to suggest changes. But there's a section of the national strategy, the first national strategy, that deals with drugs beyond heroin. And Jerry insisted that you could not have a national strategy and be credible in the scientific community and be the work of not only the Special Action Office, but the President, because it was mandated under the statute. And so Jerry wrote a section on each of those. I mean, obviously well qualified because of his Goodman and Gilman experiences. But he wrote a section on nicotine. And I don't know whether Jerry has read it, but how prophetic he was. And he talked about the fact that nicotine was clearly habituating and probably addicting. And he expanded on that. And for whatever reason or how it happened, about 6 or 7 days later, I get a call, never shared this with Jerry, from a couple of people around town, heavyweights, two of whom are not with us today, Clark Clifford being one of them, saying that a drug strategy ought not to include a section on nicotine. I said, isn't that interesting? Who do you represent? Oh, well, wasn't sure, general interest and so forth. How'd you happen to get a draft? Well, the gentleman did not respond to my satisfaction. And the other person I won't mention because he's still practicing, and he at least fessed up that he had a peripheral interest with 3 major tobacco companies. I was troubled by this, and I knew how passionately Jerry felt about talking about each of these drugs. And I remember talking to Jeff about it, and Jeff's response was the response that I would expect from a professional. Does Jerry believe it's important? I says, he believes it's passionately important. He says, end of case. And never shared it with Jerry, never shared it beyond with Jeff. The strategy was published. But it's interesting, it took the Surgeon General until 1988 to bite the bullet on that issue to say it was a drug that caused dependence. So I think it tells a story about Jeff and about these 3 gentlemen, because I know Jeff reflected their sentiments, but it also tells a story about Jerry.
Yeah. What do you want to do?
I just want to bring you on camera.
On camera. Stand
On
right
camera.